Excellencies, ladies and gentlemen, I welcome you back to the conference room and for our first thematic session on population dynamics and sustainable development. I have the privilege to introduce Ms. Petra Bayr, who will be the moderator of this first thematic session. Ms. Petra Bayr is member of the Austrian Parliament and spokesperson for global development of the Social Democratic Group. She chairs the Subcommittee for Development Cooperation of the Austrian Parliament since 2002. Focusing on sexual and reproductive health and rights, Petra Bayr is member of the Austrian Parliamentarian Group on Reproductive Health and Development and Vice President of the European Forum on Population and Development. In 2003, she founded the Austrian platform Stop FGM, the Austrian platform to end female genital mutilation, and in 2010, the Austrian platform Mother's Night, in order to unite various NGOs to raise awareness for maternal mortality in developing countries. Petra, I may give you the floor. I will leave you in, dear audience, I will leave you in the able hands of Petra Bayr to moderate this session and to chair this thematic session. And I, myself, I will see you later this afternoon when I can all welcome you to the reception. With these words, may I hand over the chair to Petra, please.
Thank you, Urs, and welcome back to our first thematic session on population dynamics and sustainable development, which will focus on the interrelationship between population, sustained inclusive economic growth, and sustainable development. We will look for opportunities in the future for a good balance between social, economic, and environmental development centered on human rights and equality principles. The session will be opened by a keynote presentation and followed by two discussion interventions. After the presentations, the floor will be open for participants who expressed their willingness to speak on the topic by subscribing for intervention before the conference. And if time remains, then the floor will be opened to additional questions and comments from the audience. I want to remind you that conference participants making an intervention from the floor will have 5 minutes per intervention, and the rapporteur, Professor John Hopcroft from the York University in the United Kingdom, will at the end of the session have an additional 5 to 7 minutes to summarize the discussions. And now it's a pleasure for me to introduce Professor Wolfgang Lutz. He is the founding director of the Wittgenstein Center for Demography and Global Human Capital in Vienna. Since 2002, he is also director of the Vienna Institute of Demography of the Austrian Academy of Science, and since 2008, full professor of applied statistics at the University of Vienna. He is also professoral research fellow at the Oxford Martin School for 21st Century Studies, and Professor Lutz is author and editor of 28 books and more than 200 refereed articles, including Science and Nature. Professor Lutz, may I give you the floor, and Mr. Lutz will focus on the macro level of population dynamics and sustainable development.
Good afternoon. Since the after lunch session is always a dangerous session, so I prefer to stand up and walk around and hope to also keep you awake. As was told, this Wittgenstein Center is a relatively recent foundation, a collaboration between the three institutes whose logos you see there, the IASA, the International Research Institute, a little outside Vienna in Luxembourg Castle, then the Academy Institute of Demography and the University of Economics. You also read the title, which is a very ambitious one, Towards a 21st Century Population Policy Paradigm. And this paradigm could be fostering the human resource base for sustainable development. Well, there clearly is need, particularly in the UNECE region, for some sort of a new population and development paradigm, because the old paradigms have not really dealt with situations of rapid population aging and even population shrinking. So if we just quickly recall the history of the last 40 years, there was the 1974 population conference in Bucharest, where the main topic of discussion was the effect of rapid population growth on development. So it was clearly focusing on the macro level population issues. And then in Cairo, this important emphasis on reproductive health and individual rights was added to it. And this, up to this day, this is a well-justified focus on individual rights. And you heard this morning in the first session, President Tarja Halonen so eloquently making this point. What I try to do now is sort of revisiting, reassessing the macro, the development dimensions, where lots of things has happened since Bucharest and even since Cairo, and sort of try to reassess where we stand. And this will also be done with a specific focus on the human resource base for sustainable development. I'll tell you more what I mean by this. So if you look at our logo of this conference, it very appropriately says there in this orange ball, rights plus development. So in this lecture, I try to focus on the development side. You heard about the right side before, and try what should we understand these days by development, particularly in our ECE region. This notion of the human resource base may require some explanation. In English language, sometimes you say human resources, I think HR, yes, it's personnel department, third floor, first door to the left. That's not what we mean here. There's the other word that you heard this morning, human capital, which tries to express the same thing. But again, in some languages, this sounds too capitalistic. Particularly in German, people very clearly say we don't want to equate people with some sort of capital or monetary value. So we really have troubles trying to find the right word, and in different languages there are different connotations. So I chose to use the human resource base, which is the population. It is the human resources of the aggregate of people. And what do I mean by human resources? There are many definitions, but I prefer a rather simple one, that human resources refer to the ability of people to first help themselves and also help others. This sounds very simple, but actually it's a very deep definition, and I've been thinking quite a bit, because it has these two dimensions. We are not only selfish to our own advantages, also we should try to be able to help ourselves as much as possible. There's also the dimension of helping others and being able to help others. And these human resources depend crucially on the age. Of course, a newborn baby needs help, cannot yet provide help. It depends on the health status. Some people are in better health condition to help others more than those who are in weak health condition. Education and skills, very important, and we talk much about this. But there are other characteristics like motivation, people willing to help, as well as social capital and social network. So it's a multidimensional thing. And as I mentioned, the education is central. And by education, I mean learning from the first day of life, or possibly there's even some learning in utero already taking place, up to the very old age. So there is skills and empowerment. That's the focus that we put on education. But in statistical terms, of course, formal education, the years of schooling, is most easily to measure. That's where we have the best data. But we have to be aware that this is only one aspect of the education that we want to capture. Okay, you've seen this report that my center prepared, and there is lots of empirical material, and I will make reference to this report. There's the observation that was already mentioned this morning that the UNECE region is in the late middle stages of a fundamental transition from population growth to population aging. There is a new analytical focus, namely to move the focus and stress the importance not so much only of the population numbers, of course they matter as well, but in addition look at the population quality, the education and health primarily is meant. And then there is the policy dimension that human capital in the form of education and health is what governments can most readily influence, and there's a real window of opportunities for governments to act. There's another dimension to this, because our UNECE region really is at the avant-garde of this global aging and possibly even shrinking process. We are most advanced in this global transition. Therefore, our region is sort of a relevant laboratory to see how has the world changed since the IPCD in 1994, and what can the other world regions learn from us dealing with these challenges, because we are the first to go through this. And in this report, this issue has been addressed through focusing on 4 so-called hot questions. These are rather provocative questions that challenge conventional wisdom. The first is population aging a threat for the UNECE countries? As you know, many commentators, many economists, many journalists in particular think that, of course, aging is something bad. Well, we will revisit this and see whether this is actually the case. Second, is migration a threat or an opportunity for development? Third, is fertility in the region actually too low? Most of the governments complain that it is too low, but by what criteria? What does too low mean? We'll discuss this a bit. And then the fourth and very important also are the UNECE countries becoming less equal societies. So because of lack of time, I will only focus on the first and the third questions, but then in the conclusions come back to all 4 questions. Now, is population aging bad for productivity growth? That's essentially what people are afraid of. And when we discuss this very complicated issue, we really have to distinguish between 3 levels. The word aging actually originally is an individual aging. We as people are maturing from babies, we are growing up, we are maturing, and we are aging, and then at the end get weaker, and at the very end we die. Well, using this same terminology of aging for a society is highly problematic, and some people are not really aware of the problems that are involved. Societies don't die out when they get old. It's just the mean age is taken to be increased, or a proportion above a certain age threshold. So we must be really careful of translating what is true for individuals to societies. And then we also have the firm level, because productivity in our economies is largely produced also by the firms. So we'll have to distinguish between these 3 levels. At the individual level, of course, the story is relatively bleak if we have one cutoff point. Physical strength starts to decline around age 25. There's little variation. For some it starts with 22, others with 27, but that's a fact of nature. The speed of mental perception starts to decline after age 30. That sounds even more worrisome. And I don't think we want to hear that, but that is very clearly tested, that just the speed of processing, really after the age of 30 around, there's only downhill movement. But the good thing is that experience increases with age. And with experience, we develop skills to compensate, or possibly even overcompensate this decline in the speed of processing. So when it comes to cognitive abilities, we can clearly see that those who are demanding cognitive abilities that require experiences, that require complex thinking, they actually don't decline with age, but the immediate reaction do decline. So it's already at the individual level a relatively complex story. At the firm level, some first superficial analysis seem to show that indeed, if you look at companies that have a young workforce, they are more productive. And this is the case because the ICT industry, the modern technology-based industry, they both tend to be most productive. And because they are so recent, they tend to have young people mostly because they recruited them recently. Now, when you control for the industry, look at the different sectors of industry, then this picture disappears, and then a much more differentiated picture shows it is not clearly anymore that countries who have a young workforce are more productive within any given industry. Actually, what is most productive is a good age mix. You have some young ones and you have some experienced ones, and they learn from each other and they have some division of labor. So that's what some of these studies that are relatively complex, because typically the firms don't provide both at the same time the data on their productivity and on their staff aging and skills. So we have to go through the social security systems and so on to get this data. What about the national level? That's, of course, what development mostly refers to. And here some econometric studies show that actually societies that have a high proportion of 50 to 60-year-olds, this proportion shows the highest significance. This is not surprising because productivity is usually measured through wages, and these groups, particularly men aged 50 to 60, they are the biggest salary earners in our societies, and therefore if their proportion is higher, also productivity is measured to be highest. But there's also some, I should say maybe up to now, we haven't really seen any empirical evidence of negative consequences of population aging on economic growth. In part because there's no society in the world yet who has reached this stage where the baby boom generation has already retired. Germany is the oldest country, not only in Europe, but in the world, as measured by the median age. Yet Germany seems to be economically relatively robust if you compare it to other younger, demographically younger countries in Europe. So it can't be just the age structure that makes the difference. Japan is the oldest country when it comes to the proportion above age 65. But again, you've seen some signs of economic recovery recently in Japan. This has to do more with macroeconomic policies than with the age structure of the population. So what I want to say, the story here is very complex. It is still inconclusive, and most of the negative outlook that people give with respect to population aging is really based on very simple models rather than empirical observations so far. Now let's come to the trends. In the brochure you find this all. This is life expectancy at birth. You all know that there is a sort of a difference in Europe. You have the Western European countries that have a continuous increase in life expectancy, and I should say far beyond the levels that were thought to be possible a few decades ago. Just remember the UN population projections of the 1960s and 70s. They thought that 75 is the maximum life expectancy that can be reached, and then leveling off. And as reality surpassed it, they moved it up to 78 and then 80. And now we are well above 80, and there doesn't seem to be a sign of leveling off. So this is one of the big debates among demographers. Are we close to the maximum life expectancy or not? But then you see, particularly in the eastern part of Europe and Russia in particular, a drop in life expectancy, and for some other countries, a stalled development, which has to do with lifestyle issues and other issues. This decline is actually more pronounced for men than it is for women here. But generally, overall, there is an increasing trend, and we don't see the limit to this increase yet. What you see here is a probabilistic population pyramid. You all know the population pyramid, women to the right, men to the left, and then sorted by age. And this is just a way to show that at different ages for the European Union, in 2050 in this case, have different degrees of uncertainty. The lowest uncertainty is for those who are around 50 to 60 in 2050, because we already know their cohort size, how many there are, and they have not yet entered the very old ages where the future of life expectancy is uncertain. So you see for the very old, there's increasing uncertainty. This orange area shows you the 95% interval, because this depends on how life expectancy evolves. And then, of course, there is increasing uncertainty the further you go down, because of the uncertainty about future fertility rates. Now, when you calculate the conventional support ratio, which is just the number of people between 20 and 65 divided by the people 65 and over, then you see this very clear decline from currently about 4 people of so-called working age per pensioner down to around 2. And there's very little uncertainty about this because most of these cohorts are already alive. We know them, so some of the uncertainty is just migration related and some of it is mortality related. So this is really the graph that scares many of our policymakers, and actually the finance and economics ministers of the EU have sort of discussed right over this graph. And it just shows that the current pension systems are probably not tenable unchanged. But what does age and aging mean? And that's now my main message. We really need to rethink population aging. There's the sentence, age is not what it used to be. Science tells us that the meaning of age has actually been changing over the last decades. There's the saying, either 50 is the new 40 or 70 is the new 60, which implies that a 70-year-old person today is in as good shape physically, mentally, as well as with his remaining life expectancy as a 60-year-old was maybe 30, 40 years ago. So people all over the world do not only live longer today, they are also longer in good health. This is all very good news. Also, cognitive decline with age is shifting to higher ages. So as you were worrying about before about this age threshold 30, the good thing is this is shifting to higher ages, in particular for the better educated people. That's what the empirical studies clearly show, that stay mentally and physically active. That helps you to keep your cognitive abilities for longer. And when it comes to the willingness to work longer, there are some studies that show in countries where mandatory retirement ages do not exist, for instance, the US, then particularly the better educated voluntarily tend to work longer and longer. So because when we identify with what we do and when work is meaningful for us, we actually like to continue working when we are able still physically and mentally to do it. Now, this new concept of changing age is not what it used to be, can also be reflected in new indicators. The conventional old age dependency ratio, as I said, it's just taking the number of people above age 65 and dividing it by the people age 20 to 64. But now, as life expectancy increases and 65 is not what it used to be, we can take another threshold, age threshold. We try to find the age at which the remaining life expectancy in a life table is less than 15 years. So at the age where people on average have less than 15 years to live. And as life expectancy increases, of course, this age is moved up to higher ages. And then we have what we call the prospective old age dependency ratio. It takes the number of people that are older than whatever this threshold age is in a given year, divided by the number of people aged 20 up to that threshold year. And the world really looks different. You see in our European demographic data sheet that's in the back, and I have a few more copies here with me. This is the map of Europe as projected for 2030 with the conventional old age dependency ratio. And here you see that Germany is the oldest, and Finland is also very old because Finland had a very early baby boom, so it's more advanced in that aging. And Western Europe is older on average than Eastern Europe. Because in Eastern Europe, the fertility rates were fairly high up until 1990 and only then started to decline. So that is the conventional old age dependency ratio and the map of Europe that it generates. Now let's look at the prospective, this newly defined, where the remaining life expectancy is taken into account. Now all of a sudden, Eastern Europe looks much older than Western Europe, because Eastern Europe has a lower life expectancy there. So the age at which people have only 15 years more to live on average is lower in Eastern Europe, and more proportionally of the population live in this group that has 15 or less years to live. So really whether Eastern Europe is older or younger than Western Europe depends entirely on the indicator that you choose. Okay, another dimension that we want to explicitly address, and that is in this booklet for all the countries in Europe, we have reconstructed it, and actually for all countries in the world, is adding a third dimension, adding educational attainment to age and sex. So I chose Croatia because, for obvious reasons, today Croatia joined the European Union and makes the EU exactly half of the member countries of the UNECE. And you see red, this is 1970 as far as we've constructed it back. Red means no education, never having been in school. Yellow means some primary education. Light blue means completed junior secondary education, which is up to age 15. And then the dark blue means first level tertiary education, so some sort of a university post-secondary degree. And as you see in Croatia, actually in 1970, how recent this expansion of education is in Europe along elderly women. You see women above the age of 65, about half have never been to school there, and the vast majority has only had some primary education. And if you look down to the younger cohorts, they are of course better educated, because then since the 1950s, 60s, Croatia, like many other countries in the East, have invested in educational expansion. And now we go on to 1980, 1990, 2000. You see how these better educated people move up the age pyramid and replace the less educated one. That's what we call demographic metabolism. It's really the renewal from the bottom, new generations coming up with new characteristics. And this is Croatia 2010, 2020, 2030. And now Croatia will face the same issue as many other European countries, whether the better educated young people can compensate economically for their smaller number. All right, health is another very important topic in the Cairo agenda, and it also very strongly differentiates with respect to level of education. You see here Austrian data that, of course, with age, the disability increases sharply, but you see at any given age, the red line, which is the lowest education category in Austria, women with that category have about twice as high a probability of being disabled than university graduates. That's the blue line. And when you factor this in, let's just focus here on Asia at the end. When you only have a view of age-specific disability and age-specific population projections, then we expect this top line that says NES, no education scenario, increasing, because we will have more old people, and old people are to a higher degree disabled. Therefore, we will have an increase in disability. When we factor in education as well, you actually in Asia, for instance, can expect a decrease, because we know for sure that the future elderly will be better educated, and we have good reason to assume that in the future as well, the better educated have a lower disability rates, and therefore the total number of disabilities will go down. And the picture is similar for Europe here. For Western Europe, we have it. For women, we would see an increase, but if we factor in education, then it is almost stable. So what I want to say, the future looks different, whether we only look at the age-specific trends or age and education-specific trends. So education really matters. Labor force participation rate in Austria as well. You see that the red line is women with the lowest education group. They tend to drop out of the labor force after having a first child and then never go back as well. And look at the pension age. Those who are university educated women have almost a 10-year later age of retirement than those with the lowest education group. So this education distribution of the population matters for all these things. Okay, what are the key parameters to increase national level productivity? It's higher education levels are important for maintaining the economic growth, but we also have to account for the delay between educating and seeing the benefits, and higher labor force participation of women and men of all ages, and that this could possibly be combined with working less hours per week but working longer. Maybe this will be swallowed more easily by the trade unions. So the negative effects of aging have been exaggerated, that's fair to say. We don't really know exactly what they are, but we know that they can be largely ameliorated by two policies: upgrading the skill levels and increasing labor force participation. Now, the last 8 minutes I will focus on fertility. Is fertility actually too low? There is a myth around everywhere that somehow replacement level fertility is optimal. If I ask politicians or journalists, they all say, well, German fertility is too low, the French fertility is just right. according to what criteria? I mean, this replacement level fertility is a technical, very hypothetical model of a stationary population, of a population that has no migration, that has an even age structure, that has no changes in mortality, very irrelevant for considering actual populations. So for actual populations, the optimum may well lie below replacement fertility. That's the point I want to make. And there are several reasons. The one is that the current period fertility rates are downward distorted through the so-called tempo effect. Fertility is actually higher than the TFRs show us. In many countries, immigration also adds to the size of the young labor force. And when education is factored in, so the cost of education as well as the higher productivity of the educated, then a TFR of 1.6 to 1.8 may be the optimum. So we don't have time now to go through the slides of tempo-adjusted TFR. I just want to show you here the Czech Republic. The black line is the actual TFR. As you see it reported, that really precipitously declined to less than 1.2 around 2000 and then recovered somewhat. But once you iron out this tempo distortion and look at the increase in the mean age of childbearing, this is the mean age of childbearing is the dotted line, then you get adjusted TFRs that had a mild decline but much less dramatic decline. And the same is true for Austria or Spain and in all the European countries, particularly in Central Eastern European countries. You see this dark area. It can be like 0.3 to 0.4 of the TFR is due to this tempo effect, which somehow naturally will disappear at some point when the mean age of childbearing does not increase anymore. Now, this is an interesting graph. We simulated for every tenth of a TFR long-term population trend and looked at what we call the education-weighted support ratio, assuming that the young people, they cost more if you educate them well, but these more educated then are more productive when they are adults. So the red line shows a very low education scenario for Germany, no further increases. And then you see that the top of this line is reached about the optimum level around TFR of 2. Now we have a better education scenario, the red line, we invest more in education. That means overall the utility, so to say, the welfare is increased, but also the top moves slightly to the left. Now the optimum all of a sudden is around 1.7 to 1.8, and this is because you can invest more in each child because you have fewer children, and that then compensates through higher productivity later on. Well, this is a model that we don't have time to discuss, but I'm just saying that not necessarily a replacement level is the optimum. Okay, the last point is that back to the world, we have the TFR very strongly varying by level of education in virtually all countries, particularly in the developing countries, as well as infant mortality and contraceptive prevalence. This is a summary paper by John Bongartz recently where you see women in many DHS without education, primary, secondary education, and you see a very consistent picture that the demand for contraception increases with education because women want to have fewer children. Also the use increases and the unmet need declines. If you translate this into global level population projections, we could show that indeed, assuming identical education-specific fertility rates, if you have a world where no further investments are made in education, this scenario here, then the world population might increase to 10 billion. And you see the educational composition resulting to this. But if you have the fast-track scenario, most optimistic, massive investments in education, you see the world population would only go to less than 9 billion by the middle of the century, actually. And you see also with the dark blue, it's a much better educated population, and therefore women have fewer children. So education of women is a key driver of world population growth. That's the message here. It is also a key driver for economic growth. We had this proven in another contribution to science recently. Then this is probably the single most important driver of economic growth and poverty eradication, particularly the broad-based education, primary and almost universal secondary education. Now bring it back to the picture of global level climate change and the human population. This chart only wants to show you that indeed we humans are the ones who are causing the problem through consumption, energy use, but we are also the one who can bring solutions through innovation, through behavior changes. And then this is sort of the mitigation side, how we can mitigate on climate change. but then we are also affected. This is the vulnerability to climate change. And here it is important to mention that there is differential vulnerability. Not all human beings by age, gender, or level of education are equally vulnerable. And that is something we also need to take into account. And that affects the population. So the population structure not only matters for the CO2 emissions, but it also matters for the degree of vulnerability. And there's a big exercise now in the IPCC, so-called shared socioeconomic pathways. And I mention this because in your brochure you see some of these scenarios being calculated for the Europe ECE region. And we have actually, for all of the countries of the world, now produced, according to these 5 shared pathways, education, age, and sex-specific population projections that try to capture the alternative futures here. Well, the time is over. Let's just summarize. So a 21st century population policy paradigm that I would tentatively call fostering or maybe strengthening the human resource base for sustainable development. And the policies that are straightforward, that can strengthen education and health, that leads to, most importantly, the empowerment of women and men of all ages and in all settings. There's no doubt whatsoever that literacy and better education helps people to empower, to be able to help themselves and help others better. Then we looked about the better ability to cope with the consequences of population aging. We did not have time to discuss, but there's strong evidence that education helps better integration of migrants and to lower the inequalities that we have in societies. It leads to lower child mortality, better reproductive health, and lower fertility in today's high fertility countries. And it helps to lead to sustainable development, both through higher mitigative and adaptive capacity to environmental change. So this seems like all the necessary ingredients for really becoming a population level goal. And again, I wanted to point at this logo that combines the rights and the development, and that should be the topic of our discussions. Thank you very much.